Washington Journal continues.
A focus now on Iran and the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. Behnam Ben Taleblu is an Iranian security political issues expert at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Mr. Taleblu, explain first the role Iran's been playing amid the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. What do they think they can gain amid this crisis?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. The Islamic Republic is leveraging its regional strategy. It's created or co-opted a whole series of proxy terror groups across the multiple battlefields in the Middle East that we see today. Battlefields that used to have U.S. force partners, battlefields that used to have U.S. forces themselves, some places that still have U.S. forces operating. And in all of these jurisdictions, it's got one element of a terror group that has a certain kind of capability: drones, rockets, missiles, mortars, IRAMs, things of that nature. And what Iran is doing now in the post-October 7 space, as Israel is continuing to fight Hamas in Gaza and moving further south, is that it's slowly leveraging this network that they themselves call the axis of resistance, or mehvar muqawamat in Persian, as they like to say. And they bring elements of this axis online to create a conflict spiral in the hopes of preventing Israel from being able to finish off Hamas. And in some cases, these proxies are attacking the Israelis, or what they believe is Israeli-linked shipping or Israeli-linked interests, as the Houthis, Iran's proxy in Yemen, are doing. And in other areas, they're trying to take advantage of U.S. risk aversion in places like Iraq and Syria by stepping up the rate of fire there. There's been about a reported 74, 75 attacks on the U.S. force presence there, all by Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. And the goal there is to get the U.S. to run towards the conflict between Hamas and Israel and create a deconfliction agreement, much like the 1973 deconfliction agreements between the Arabs and the Israelis. And in the hopes of the Iranians being able to do this, they're trying to use violent ends to achieve a political means.
When we say Iran-backed, what do we mean? Is that just money? Is that money and training? Is that Iranian military officials being embedded in some of these groups? What does that term mean?
It's broadly material and political support, and you can unpack material in two major ways. They're not the only ways, but they're two important ways to understand how Iran creates, co-ops, but ultimately controls this axis of resistance. It's money on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's weapons, and then the maintenance, training, logistics, liaising with other elements of Iran's terror apparatus, liaising with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, liaising with the Quds Force, the elite foreign operations branch of that. So there's the material support and then the political support, the consistent political cover, diplomatic cover that Iran also provides these proxies. One example, of course, that is a game changer and worth noting is that right into the lead-in of the Thanksgiving holiday, for the first time ever, the Iran-backed militias in Iraq fired a ballistic missile. Different trajectory, different speed than, of course, rockets, mortars, and drones, which the Iran-backed militias in Iraq were firing at us since 2019. So Iran is able to escalate by introducing a different kind of weaponry that it provides to these groups, and that is one example of material support.
Where did that ballistic missile go?
That ballistic missile targeted, I believe, a U.S. base in northern Iraq. Fortunately, no U.S. fatalities, but I think, unfortunately, given Iran's capability and intent to continue to fire, it may only be a matter of time before there is a major injury beyond the traumatic brain injuries that have been reported, about 59 total brain injuries so far. But I fear that this is set to continue.
So drill in on the significance of this attack from over the weekend on from Yemen, on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, and also a U.S. Navy vessel engaging here.
So these are a few different elements at play that Iran is trying to bring together. Element one is, of course, Iran's material support to the Houthis. The Houthis are far actually outdated in terms of their historical significance and their presence in Yemen. They're much, much older than the Islamic Republic, but the Islamic Republic co-opted this group through material support, through political support. And in 2014, 2015, when these actors overtook Sana'a, overtook the country, ousted the government, and continued to fight a Saudi-backed coalition, more and more Iranian weaponry came in. Land attack cruise missiles, drones, short-range ballistic missiles, and now medium-range ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles. The Houthis are the only proxy of Iran to have used anti-ship ballistic missiles, most recently in this attack over the weekend, as well as the only proxy of Iran to have medium-range ballistic missiles. This means ballistic missiles that can fly over 1,000 kilometers. These are changes to the way we need to look at Iran's apparatus of terror in the region. In 2017, for example, the Houthis talked about their intent to enter a conflict against Israel, either with Lebanese Hezbollah on their side or either with the Palestinians on their side, but they did not yet have the capability. As of 2019, the Houthis have had that capability, and as of 2023, they've had that capability to begin to fire at Israel, which is over 1,000 kilometers away from Yemen. When you add in the shipping component, which is part of a larger Israel-Iran shadow war, there has been one direct attack by Iran using a drone against Israeli-linked commercial shipping. This is part of this larger shadow war between Israel and Iran we've seen with cyber attacks on ports, attacks on shipping, as well as attacks on critical infrastructure that both countries have tried to use to adjudicate their larger strategic competition in the Middle East. The Iranians, obviously, when they chant death to Israel, they mean it, and now they're showing you with the material support that they have the capability to act on it.
Staying on the Houthis for a second, from the Washington Times today, I just want to get your thoughts on this analysis of this piece on the naval attacks. Specialists warn that the Houthis are something of a wild card and don't necessarily abide by the same cost-benefit analysis that drives the decision-making of other Iran-affiliated groups such as Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias, which have engaged in sharp but more limited confrontations with the U.S. and Israel since October the 7th.
You know, there's two kinds of extremes, both in Washington and capitals around the world, I've noticed, that are trying to analyze this Iranian proxy network. And neither extreme is a helpful analogy to understand how this axis of resistance works. So if you'll permit me, I'll go wide and then we'll go specific.
Please.
Group A, folks in Washington around the world, believe that the relationship between patron and proxy is like this, that Iran just gets on the phone, immediately calls in the order, and there is zero local actor agency. The Houthis, the Iraqis, Lebanese Hezbollah have zero say, and they immediately implement what the Iranians want. That is one extreme that I don't believe is empirically borne out. The other extreme is an academic extreme born of the principal agent problem, that over time, the agent or the proxy gets more leverage over the principal because they're the ones who are risking their lives, they're the ones on the front lines, they're the ones who know the local terrain, they're the ones interacting with other local actors, and over time they get more leverage and they have the capability to keep saying no, no, no. Neither of these models is correct. The way Iran has built this axis of resistance is by creating and co-opting through that material support that we talked about local actors that share the same interests. So the Houthis are shooting at the same people the Islamic Republic wants to shoot at. Hamas in Gaza has been shooting at the same people that the Islamic Republic wants to shoot at. In fact, Iran's foray into the Levant, foray into Gaza, where the majority of the population is Sunni, is built on Hamas as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad being a spoiler to the peace process and then being an even more aggressive and violent spoiler to the peace process after the Second Intifada. So the way these groups work is they have local interests and the Islamic Republic says, I can help you with those local interests, and then it co-opts that local interest through foreign material and political support. So the Houthis can set their own rate of fire, but they have the fire thanks to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is, of course, why it was actually quite hard for many in the intelligence community, many in the academic community, many in the analytical community to say, is there a smoking gun of Iranian support on October 7th? You have all the Wall Street Journal sources with their local sources saying yes, and then you have Reuters with all their local sources saying no, and it just depends on your perspective and your understanding of how this proxy network works and which camp you will fall into.
We're talking about Iran's role when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war, the conflict that's happening right now. Taking your phone calls as well if you have questions about the history, about the political dynamics of the region. Now would be a very good time to call. Behnam Ben Taleblu is with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a senior fellow there specializing in Iran, as we talk about Israel and Hamas. When it comes to Israel and Iran, are you surprised that Israel hasn't struck Iran directly since October the 7th?
I'm surprised partially that they were not willing to go as far as directly attribute everything that happened on October 7th to the Islamic Republic. Much like Washington here, I think there is a political consideration at play, and the political consideration at play is first focus on the most urgent threat, first focus on the jurisdiction that launched this threat, focus on that local actor that launched that threat. That would be the terrorist group Hamas. It's likely that and some have used this to talk about, the U.S. ISIS campaign first and the priorities that were changing in the region in 2014, 2015 for the U.S. They used to say first Hitler, then Stalin. So in this case, perhaps the Israelis are doing a phased approach. But in general, the Iranians and the Israelis have had this shadow war that we talked about. I think after October 7, there is no going back to that shadow war. Make no mistake, the Islamic Republic armed, trained, equipped Hamas precisely for these kind of days, to be able to be part of the regime's larger strategy of a death by 1,000 cuts against Israel. And why the regime is bringing more of this proxy network online to bail out Hamas is that it wants to force Israel, and in general the U.S. now, which has suffered 74, 75 strikes in Iraq and Syria, to absorb this escalation rather than respond to it. So precisely by threatening an escalation spiral, they are trying to get everyone to say the responsible thing is to de-escalate. And here that is being taken advantage of politically in Washington. So I'm not surprised that responsible, risk-averse actors are not looking to escalate the conflict. The U.S. is not looking to escalate the conflict. Israel, in the short term, has actually rather limited aims, the destruction of the terrorist group that tried to kill it. But that will come with political baggage. And that's where the Islamic Republic is going to try to flesh out this conflict.
Is there a historical comparison to this proxy network that Iran has built?
I don't see one. Some like to say, any alliance network is by default a proxy network. But even the way this proxy network works, sometimes there's a
network with a religious component too.
It's a religious component, but broadly, the Islamic Republic is ecumenical in this sense. So you have Sunni and Shiite in this. In fact, the front lines of this conflict in Gaza, vast majority, if not the entire population, there is Sunni, not Shiite, and they're Arab, not Persian. So when Iran has this ecumenical message, I should say, when the Islamic Republic of Iran has this ecumenical message, its angle of entry is not, are you Arab or are you Persian? Are you Muslim or are you not Muslim? The first angle of entry outside the Middle East, I should say, is what kind of disposition do you harbor? You see this with the ecumenical outreach of Iranian cultural and political and religious centers in places like the tri-border area in South America, for instance. This is how far the regime can take. Do you harbor an anti-status quo disposition? They use, leftist, groups in Latin America to enter the conversation about being anti-America, being anti-Israel, and then getting those groups to try to do something about it. So it's the co-opting of any local cause. But in the heartland of the Middle East, yes, it's co-religionists, and they're co-religionists that they're willing to arm, train, and equip to actually do things as heinous as we saw on October 7th.
Let me stop there. Plenty of callers for you already.
Sure.
We'll continue the discussion with Behnam Ben Taleblu this morning. This is Janet in the Bronx, line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm listening to him, and he has all of this research from all of these other people who saying it's Iran, it's Iran, it's Iran. And it was the same thing with the Iraq war. It's Iraq, it's Iraq, it's Iraq, when it was actually someone else who started the war. So right about now, I just don't. I think they're just trying to get the U.S. involved and to attack Iran. And also, there's just so much that's going on that's not being reported correctly. They're speaking about these Hamas tunnels when 60 Minutes reported on those tunnels like 10 years ago because of the blockade. Those tunnels was being used so that they could actually do commerce. Donkeys was going through the tunnels. So there's a lot that's not being told. And I think from when we had Colin Powell holding up that little vial and whoever gave him that information to say, oh, no, they have all of this weapons of mass destruction, they're doing the same thing here.
Janet, let me give Behnam Ben Taleblu a chance to respond.
Thank you for your comment, Shannon, and good morning. Listen, I wouldn't want to draw the analogy with Iraq, of course, because I was willing to tell you that already there's so many different elements at play. I mentioned, of course, the Wall Street Journal story with their own local sources that says, yes, it was Iran. I mentioned the Reuters story with their own local sources that says, no, it was not Iran. But I tried to paint a picture today talking about the larger proxy network and the regime's larger strategy, where there is lots of empirical evidence for this. I talked about them going into battlefields to create groups. Examples of groups they've created are Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Badr Corps in Iraq. I've talked about them going into places that they co-opt existing groups that predate their strategy. Examples of that are Hamas in Gaza or the Houthis in Yemen. There is ample empirical evidence. These are not politically contentious issues either in Washington or in the analytical community. What the politically contentious point here is the degree of Iranian involvement. Even the administration, which is taking the side of the Reuters story, you could say, I'm just putting it into two camps to make it easier, taking the side of Iran not being involved on October 7, even they are talking about the history of Iran training, arming, backing, equipping Hamas. And when you look at the material capabilities that Hamas has, not just even the 11,000 rockets fired so far in the conflict, but looking at, for example, as the Israelis move deeper and deeper into Gaza, the anti-tank weapons, where that came from, North Korean copies, Soviet copies, Iranian copies of anti-tank weapons. So those terror tunnels, much like the trade routes of the Middle East, where there are the same routes for, in the Red Sea, for instance, where the Houthis are, the arms trafficking routes mirror the drug trafficking routes, mirror the human trafficking routes. Those tunnels, of course, mirror the weapons trafficking routes as well. And that's precisely how, even under a blockade, Iran was able to provide material support for its proxy in Gaza, Hamas.
Have you seen enough to say where you come down on that spectrum of Iranian involvement when it comes to October the 7th?
You know, from what I've heard about the nature of Iran's relationship with these proxies, and again, you brought up a good word, which is alliance. Some like to define this relationship as an alliance. I think here in the West, we're spoiled by the technical definition of alliance in the post-World War II world. We think an ally needs to look alike, think alike, share exactly the same values. But the way the Islamic Republic can so successfully, with so few resources, create, co-opt, and control groups and sustain that relationship over time is it takes the old world definition of an alliance. If you're willing to shoot at the same person I want to shoot at,
The enemy of my enemy?
Precisely. And this lower definition for victory is how they've been so successful. So where I look at the data, which is these random pieces of dots that you have based on media reporting from the region, what allows me to connect the dots of that data is this larger assessment of Iranian strategy, which I tried to present for the viewers here today.
To Michael in Plainfield, Illinois, line for Independence. Good morning.
Hi, I'd like your guest to follow up on what he was just saying. My concern, my observation is that we have this tendency to demonize the other side, terrorists, devils. This is always our terminology that we use. But it seems to me from what your guest is saying that this is really a superimposition of a regional conflict between Iran and us and these other players, which is leading to genocide in Gaza and everything else. But here's what I really want to know your opinion on. Do you think that this is being done for revenge, that we have actually lost control of a practical approach to this regional conflict, or are we just stuck in our own rhetoric, for lack of a better way of putting that? That's what I want your comment on.
Thank you, Michael. I think there's two layers of questions I want to unpack a little bit. One is the regional conflict and one is the revenge element. On the regional conflict, you framed it as a U.S.-Iran issue. Yes, the U.S. and Iran, or yes, the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran have had so many things they've quarreled over the past 4 decades, and the order and structure and nature of governments across the region has been chief amongst them. But this current conflict, the military iteration of fighting we're seeing post-October 7th, is not a U.S.-Iran conflict. It's part of the Islamic Republic's larger regional strategy to act on this ideational, ideological impulse it has, where it puts death to Israel, death to America at the center of its foreign and security policy. And here, that's where the create, co-opt, control vector of this axis of resistance matters, because they're slowly arraying these groups, they're slowly bringing these groups online, they're providing material support to these groups that basically, like one actor that we haven't mentioned yet, Lebanese Hezbollah, function as a knife they've put against the neck of the Israelis. And over time, they're sharpening that knife to box in the Israelis to make sure that the most powerful military in that region, the Israeli Defense Forces, has less and less and less room for maneuver. So it's about eroding your adversary's policy options so that the regime can act on those genocidal impulses it has when it writes death to Israel on missiles, when it shoots Stars of David with missiles during target practice, and when it actually has religious officials, political officials, military officials engage in anti-Israel and anti-Semitic diatribes and slurs. So the regional element of the conflict is not U.S.-Iran, it's Iran-Israel. And it's brought in the U.S. through this one facet, which is as Iran sees its proxy getting pummeled in Gaza, it's trying to take advantage of American risk aversion by targeting more U.S. assets. That's why the Houthis, shot down a drone. That's why the Houthis are doing something that involves going against international freedom of navigation, something the U.S. cares deeply about. And that's why there's been precisely 74, 75 attacks on the U.S. in Iraq and Syria. It's to see that the longer the conflict in Israel with Hamas goes on, the more likely Iran is to turn up these proxies. So Iran is trying to get us to see, hey, the heat is rising. Why don't I go put pressure on Israel to stop the war against Hamas? This is Iran trying to come in from the back door by rising the heat across the region. And one last point about revenge, and I apologize,
Please.
is that I don't see this as a revenge point, but what I do see is that as we have risk aversion here in Washington, and in particular in the Western world, the nature of the men at the helm today in Tehran, they are risk tolerant. And what they've seen is a different America across the Middle East. This is a bipartisan foreign policy failure, but a different America. They talked about this after the retreat of America from Afghanistan in 2021, that America of today is not the same America of 10, 20 years ago. Just earlier this year, the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force, the man who gave the order to launch ballistic missiles after the U.S. killed Iran's chief terrorist, wherein the U.S. received the largest ever ballistic missile strike since World War II on its forces who were unprotected. That man went on TV bragging about how American aircraft carriers, American bases today are targets. They are opportunities for the regime, whereas years ago they were threats. So it's not about revenge. One reason we don't have a successful strategy here is that we have, through our politics, through our posture, and through our lack of appropriate military planning, had a loss of deterrence. And that's why an actor like the Islamic Republic, with much less capability than us, feels much more confident taking us on, because they know they can't win the balance of capability, but they're betting on winning the balance of resolve.
When it comes to the actors in the region that have been brought online here and are sort of circling Israel, as you were talking about, is there a regional group that has not been brought online yet? Is there one we should know more about?
The X factor there, in my view, is certainly going to be one of Iran, if not Iran's most successful proxy, which is Lebanese Hezbollah. Lebanese Hezbollah has been firing already at Israel. They have been firing IRAMs. They've been firing select kinds of rockets, 20 to 70 kilometers. You've already had internally displaced persons in Israel from the north just to, vacate that northern territory that does border Lebanon. You've had some drone attacks. My fear is twofold. One, the greater volume of not just rocket, but precision-guided munition and missile fire from Lebanon over into Israel. That's one. And two, the Lebanese Hezbollah replicating the anti-Axis area denial things and attacks on shipping that we've seen the Houthis do in the Red Sea. So would Lebanese Hezbollah actually use anti-ship cruise missiles, which they have, and in the 2006 war has actually hit an Israeli ship, would they replicate that strategy again? Thus far, Hezbollah, just like the Islamic Republic officially, is trying to have its cake and eat it too, trying to engage in cross-border attacks, but not beget a wider escalation that would lead to the destruction of this capability. While so many of these other actors have local interests that are aligned with the Islamic Republic's interest as well, Lebanese Hezbollah was created by Iran to be part of that larger death by a thousand cut strategy against Israel. And precisely since the last major conflict with Hezbollah, 2006, Iran has been creating this arsenal of up to 200,000 rockets, mortars, and missiles, including precision-guided munitions, in the hands of its chief proxy in the region, not just to be expended to save Hamas, but this is a tool that Iran has created and kept there to prevent an Israeli overt strike on its nuclear program or to respond to an Israeli overt strike on its nuclear program. And it's not likely to be expended in the short term, in my view, but if Iran senses Hamas is about to be finished, perhaps the calculus with Hezbollah will change.
To Thor in Annapolis, Maryland, Republican. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. I just have a brief question regarding Iran. If we think about their chief goal in the world right now, I would not characterize it as world domination. I would think their main goal would be characterized as projecting regional power, regional stability in favor of Iran. So is there, my question for you, sir, is there a chance to, from an Abrams Accord perspective, to bring other key players in the region to come to the table and sort of strong arm Iran to bring them back to the table to take a step back and funding all this terrorist activity? Thank you.
Morning, Thor. You hit the magic AA word, Abraham Accords, which unfortunately I did not get to mention yet, so allow me with respect to work backwards through your question. One reason I believe, of course, that you can continue to connect the dots beyond the strategy that we talked about this morning for Iran in the region is that Iran did feel encircled by the Abraham Accords. They were talking about this from 2020 to present, that the governments actually that had signed those peace agreements with Israel would pay a cost. And in fact, the last speech before October 7th, on October 3rd, of Iran's supreme leader did end with a gigantic diatribe against Israel, but also against the Arab countries that not only had agreements, but that were seeking agreements with Israel. And the supreme leader said—
And remind folks who those countries were.
In the past, those who had established ties, the initial batch, you had, I believe, the UAE and Bahrain. Then you had Sudan and Morocco join on, and then the crown jewel, if you will, of where the Abraham Accords could be extended to, and what the Biden administration was looking to do was to bring in the Saudis, and that really would have been a game changer for the region. So Iran saw this, and in fact, one of the reasons I think Iran continued to provide material support to Hamas and is tied to October 7 is that it knew that the pictures generated from the conflict, from the military response after Israel would respond to Hamas, would create a gap between the Arabs and the Israelis, whereas that gap had significantly narrowed for most of the Trump presidency. And you had the least common denominator in the region being Iran being seen as the source of regional instability. Now the least common denominator based on the pictures coming out of the region, and you can see it across more of the Arab street than the Arab state, is, well, what about the Palestinians, the Palestinian issue, Palestinian suffering, the nature of the war in Gaza? So in this way, Iran has tried to, with images, change the least common denominator and put pressure on governments that would like to move closer to Israel. In my view, yes, it absolutely does need to be resuscitated, the Abraham Accords. The Saudis, in my view, still have absolutely a strategic interest, but in the short term, there's the overriding political challenges of how do you get there. And much of that will depend on the optics of what is happening in Gaza, not just what is happening materially on the ground. So I think you were absolutely right to mention the Abraham Accords, and that, in my view, was a gigantic motivator for Iran to double down here. With the first half of your question, which contrasted regional support with world domination, ideationally, is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I should say, has not just embassies but cultural centers that propagate its perverse interpretation of 12-er Shiite Islam, and that's I would call that Khomeinism. It's not even directly linked to mainstream 12-er Shiite Islam. I can say this as someone with a little bit of a background in some theological studies. So that's the first thing. But you are correct, it does seek to dominate the region. But what happens in the Middle East, as you know, doesn't stay in the Middle East. 2 years ago, for example, the Europeans mocked former President Trump. I'm just giving you one political example of what happens in the Middle East, doesn't stay in the Middle East. Mocked former President Trump, who tried to, via the United Nations, extend a multilateral arms embargo against Iranian weapons exports and imports. 2 years after, European citizens, European critical infrastructure was being targeted by an expanding radius of Iranian drone proliferation to include Iranian drones going to Russia to use against those targets in Ukraine. Now there are reports that Iranian close-range ballistic missiles may go to Russia as well to supplement Russia's war effort in Ukraine. So what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. And we should not forget that just like Iran has this proxy network, over the past 10 years, politically and militarily and economically certainly, but also from an intelligence perspective, Iran has moved closer and closer and closer to America's great power rivals, China and Russia. So in some sense, Iran is more willing than ever before to be a pawn in the hands of China and Russia amid their larger games of strategic competition with the West.
There's been no lack of effort to sanction Iran. How have they been able to create these weapons programs to supply all of these proxies and also a significant component to Russia in its war with Ukraine?
That's an excellent question. Some of the weapons that we're seeing right now, when you look at the cost of some of the drones going to Russia, for example, the Shahed 136, it costs anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000. That's cheap. Those are weapons of the weak, and they require much more money to build interceptors, to build radars, to build trackers, to actually detect these low and slow flying threats. It's a greater investment the U.S. and the Israelis and our Arab partners in the region have to make to detect, track, defeat, and destroy the ballistic missiles or the cruise missiles that have slightly different flight profiles. But this is part of the way the Islamic Republic fights these wars. It forces you to spend more on defense just to offset their cheaper offense. So first off, these are weapons of the weak. Second off, on the sanctions front, yes, there have been different kinds of sanctions against Iran for the past 4 decades, but a fundamental problem has been the lack of will of the Biden administration in 2021 to actually enforce the sanctions regime that it inherited. Thus far, or you could count from January, February 2021 to October 2023, by conservative estimates, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been able to sell $95 billion worth of oil. Iran is also a major steel exporter now. Iran is also a major petrochemical power now. So the key with sanctions is not levying and set it and forget it. It's levying and enforcing. And in a world where the political will to enforce against Islamic Republic is low, and the sanctions prerogatives of building up other sanctions regimes for the U.S., for Cuba, Syria, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, China, and all these other malign actors in the world is so high, it's both you're fighting for attention and resources, and also it's not the central thrust of this administration's Iran policy, which is pulled punches, which unfortunately has led to the erosion of deterrence that the previous caller had mentioned.
It's about 10 minutes left with Behnam Ben Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Taking your phone calls, and there are plenty for you. This is Mary in Las Vegas, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. Forgive my thoughts because I don't know if they're in the right track or not. I just want to express them. The Palestinians put Hamas in power. Why or how that happened, I don't know. As far as Trump goes, how he acted in Helsinki was enough for me, and he is just pro-Putin. And Putin is involved with Iran, and the only thing Putin wants, he doesn't like us. He likes Trump because Trump will give him what he wants. And then I wonder, the Iran nuclear deal, if that had been expanded to improve upon it, while there was more of a moderate leader in place in Iran, could that have ameliorated what's happening now?
Mary, we'll take those questions. There's a couple there.
Sure. I think let me start with the potential expansion of the Iran nuclear deal. This is the 2015 Iran nuclear deal agreed to after about 2.5 years of negotiations directly with the Obama administration and the P5, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. In essence, that deal was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. The Trump administration did leave it on May 8th, 2018, and then slowly brought back the sanctions regime that had existed and built upon that sanctions regime in the hopes of limiting the resources for Iran's leaders to engage in the kinds of acts that we've talked about today, as well as to be able to potentially get a new deal. So in that sense, part of the political goal of the late Trump administration and early Biden administration was what you could call a longer, stronger deal. But remember those sanctions that we were just speaking about a few moments ago. The Biden administration's theory of the case is that concessions got that 2015 nuclear deal, not pressure. And that's why there was a lack of enforcement of sanctions. And in a sense, the administration most unfortunately undercut its own position of trying to get a better deal. And that's why you could kind of draw a downward sloping line of the goals the administration had when it came to trying to put Iran's nuclear program back in the box. If you look at, for instance, during the campaign period from September 2020, I think even Biden wrote an op-ed in CNN about what his potential Iran policy would be. They talked about, again, this longer and stronger deal. That was the stated goal until April 2021, 4 months into the Biden administration, when the first rounds of indirect U.S.-Iran diplomacy happens. Then starting from April 2021 to September 2022, the goal moves from longer and stronger to let's just cleanly resurrect the deal that Trump left before. But after the Iranians walk away in August and September of 2022 from a very generous European brokered offer, then the administration's goal becomes, okay, we can't even get the clean JCPOA back. Let's try to get an interim deal or a half deal or a freeze for freeze or an interim measure. And that defined much of the diplomacy that we saw that even bled into hostage diplomacy that even bled into merely trying to cap Iran's escalation of uranium enrichment to 60% purity. And in my view, if you ask me what is the Biden administration's overall goal with Iran today, even though the stated aim is to try to get the JCPOA back, to try to get the deal you mentioned back, given its cognizance of the loss of leverage, and given its unwillingness to enforce those sanctions, and given its cognizance of the politics and optics of the Iran issue in this town, as well as in the transatlantic community, I think so long as the Iranians don't go to weapons-grade uranium, which is 90% purity, or leave the NPT, or actually test some weapon underground that we may not have known about, so long as the Iranians don't do those things, I'm pretty sure the administration, despite this negative sloping line of having to be constantly defined downward, I'm sure they will try to declare some kind of political victory of, we tried to get the deal back, but the Iranians didn't let us, but we did the responsible thing. I think most unfortunately, Iran has actually amassed more nuclear material under the Biden administration's watch. It's even as of 2021, 2022, made irreversible nuclear gains that even if we do get the same deal or a much better deal back, is not going to really be able to address because you can't take away this new knowledge the regime has. But ultimately, every effort the administration had to try to build on nuclear diplomacy was undercut by its theory of the case, which is an unwillingness to enforce sanctions because it doesn't see sanctions as helpful. And this is really where your philosophical difference will produce a different kind of policy that will lead to different politics of how you pursue. And in my view, this is a self-defeating exercise, but it's the philosophical path the administration has been on, that less sanctions is more beneficial.
Out to Long Island. This is Peter on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Good morning. I just want to say thank you to C-SPAN for having this guest on. He's made some great points. I never realized that, all of our enemies just happen to be connected. Like Iran is behind all the bad stuff in the Middle East, Russia behind everything bad in Europe, China, everything bad in Asia. Can't forget the people and terrorists coming over the border. And honestly, I think Cuba looked at us funny too. So I think they're connected to Iran as well. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you for the kind note.
To Ken in New Jersey, Democrat. Good morning.
Hi. I just have an idea. I want to run it past your guest. I am convinced that the United States, the war planners in the Pentagon, are now planning an attack on Iran for early next year, maybe in the spring, because they're the Iranians have these cruise missiles that have a range of about 1,000 miles now, and are supposedly 3 months away from developing nuclear weapons. So I think it's been decided that it'll be a lot easier for regime change in Iran before they get nukes than after they get nukes. And I'm just curious to see what your guest might think about this possibility. So thank you. I'll take my answer offline.
Thank you, Ken. A couple of points there, but I think broadly the Biden administration's policy towards Iran, again, based on that risk aversion that we talked about, based on the idea of not even being willing to enforce those economic measures, and if you look at the response ratio of it actually going against or trying to shoot back at, or in self-defense, I should say, the militias in the region, be they in Iraq or in Syria, there were 78 attacks from January 2021 to March 2023 against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. Then again, from October 2023 to present, there were 74, 75 attacks. This is over 150 attacks. The U.S. has kinetically responded, and exceptionally lightly at that. And more often than not in Syria, where it's more of a free fire zone, than in Iraq, where there's a real political and material cost to the use of force there, given some of the attempts by Iran's friends in the Iraqi parliament to try to evict the U.S. over time. The U.S. has responded, maybe 7 or 8 times, exceptionally minimally. I do not believe that the Biden administration is looking to even start a war with the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, it has even let some of the missile program expand. It needed to do much, much more to get tough on Iranian ballistic missiles. One thing I would have liked to see, and this is entirely in the diplomatic realm, was to actually defend the UN sanctions architecture on Iran's missile program, which sadly lapsed this October 18th. It was a day built into the deal, which was still, despite the US and Iran leaving the deal remains in place at the United Nations. It's kind of on life support. It's taking on its own bureaucratic inertia. The administration should have done this thing called snapback to restore this multilateral baseline against Iranian ballistic missile testing, Iranian missile transfers. The range of some of the Iranian cruise missiles actually is up to 2,000 kilometers, scarily now. Ballistic missiles also kind of locked in at 2. Some of the drones go to 2,500. The lack of enforcement of the economic tool, coupled with the pulling punches and the very limited military response after the U.S. was hit, leads me to believe that no, not at all. The U.S. is not even remotely itching for a conflict. And in fact, the U.S. has pulled back at the table every single time there has been a chance to even use the military tool. So my critique is the administration has been too soft, not too hard on the Islamic Republic.
Running short on time, remind viewers who Mahsa Amini was and what her legacy is over a year after her death.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. Mahsa Amini was a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman killed due to allegedly improperly wearing her headscarf. Iran has this hyenas force called the Morality Police, which is integrated into the larger law enforcement forces or police forces that actually roam the country and have the authority to make arrests. She was actually beaten and she died 3 days later, hospitalized due to wounds she sustained from this alleged Morality Police officer. People saw her photos on social media within hours of reports of her being hospitalized, and then within moments of her actually passing, September 2022, protests began outside the hospital, then spread over to 150 different cities, towns, and villages with different demographics across the entire country, chanting death to the dictator. This is part and parcel of a larger series of boom and bust cycles of protests that we've seen from the society against the state in Iran since 2017. This is fundamentally a drastically different population than the government that we've talked about today. You have a fundamentally anti-American, anti-Israeli government. You have fundamentally a different kind of population there. They want more integration with the world, versus the Islamic Republic's government wants more separation. And ultimately, Mahsa Amini's death continues to be used as a galvanizing point to drive future anti-regime protests, and in essence is something that I think Democrats and Republicans, people who look at the nuclear issue, people who look at the Israel-Iran proxy war, a shadow war issue, need to also put into the front and center, because the real change from within, the real change against Iran and the real pressure on Iran will ultimately come from within, because that country has had a century-long history of fight against authoritarianism and a fight for popular sovereignty and a fight for representative governments. And regardless of all that is going on in the region, that fight is set to continue.
Why didn't that protest movement bring about that change that they were looking for?
In my view, well, certainly there were many things that the Western world could have done better, and in particular Washington could and should have done better. Much more overt rhetorical support, better support for communications technology and access, enabling Iranians to get access to the internet. But make no mistake, the Iranian people are unarmed and very bravely continue to come out and protest against this Zionist regime. The Islamic Republic has an apparatus of repression. From on the low end, you have these vigilante groups, you have the Basij paramilitary forces, you have the formalized police forces that they call the law enforcement forces. They have a special unit called the Yagana Vijay, which actually is their SWAT team that actually kind of cracks down on street protests. Then you have, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself. And this is a cocktail of repression that the regime shakes up and throws against different protesters in different provinces across Iran. And even as these protests spread, the regime continued to use force in gross ways, just like they did in 2019. 2019, of course, you had 1,500 people reportedly killed in protests in mid to late November, early December. And the regime couples this street repression with cyber repression and an internet blackout. And it's a story that we cannot forget about, no matter the shooting across the region.
I know we're a bit past our time. Do you have time for one or two more phone calls?
Sure,
Folks waiting.
absolutely.
This is Pat in Keyport, New Jersey, a Republican. Go ahead. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. My question is about we've seen reports in the last 2 days that people in the Muslim countries are encouraging Israel to continue the fight against Hamas. But are there people in these same countries that say they oppose Iran, they want Hamas destroyed? Are there people in these countries that are silently funding Hamas through groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Saudi donors funneling money into other Sunni groups that make their way through? Iran may be the front guy, but are these other groups funding Hamas as well? Thank you.
Well, Hamas's largest external patron, regardless of the Arab-Persian divide and regardless of the Sunni-Shia divide, remains the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But then there's always, of course, been concern over the terror financing and the permissive jurisdiction that Qatar has provided to Hamas over the years. Historically, in the past, I believe Algeria also had something of a role for political or material support. Prior to the Arab Spring, of course, we knew that this political branch, if you want to call it that, basically where Ismail Haniyeh was in Syria, not in Qatar. So there is, of course, a significant foreign nexus to the capabilities that Hamas has.
Last call, Charlotte, North Carolina. This is David, Independent. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking my call. My question is, and I have a couple of comments as well. Israeli spokesperson on every channel in the U.S., they constantly want the U.S. to get involved in this war. Same thing going on this morning. They desperately want Biden to attack Iran. How many of them are going to go when the U.S. starts the war? How many of them are going to go fight the war? It will be the poor and middle-class people who will be fighting the war. And by the way, how many times Israel has attacked Iran in secret? Have we forgotten the Stuxnet? What happened with that one? And U.S. destroyed Iranian airliner in 1988, killing 290 civilians. So these people, they desperately want the U.S. to go to war with Iran.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, you want to take those up?
Sure, there was a couple of different points there. Yes, there is a larger Israel-Iran shadow war, but I think the caller mistakenly, respectfully got the causal logic wrong. It's not just that Israel out of the blue woke up and helped create a cyber program against Iran's nuclear program. It's that Iran has cheated, obfuscated international inspectors from actually looking at its nuclear program. Every overt site today that is a nuclear enrichment facility was once a covert facility. The Islamic Republic of Iran was then and remains the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism that has created this terror apparatus that has made it much more lethal over time. So if you were, the sole Jewish democratic state in the region, I think responsible planning would require at least some kind of kinetic pushback, as you saw along the lines that the Israelis have been doing in what they have called historically the war between the wars. I don't at all believe that this is the Israelis trying to get the Americans into another fight. In one instance, of course, the Israelis are trying to get more munitions, resupply even of the batteries, the Iron Dome batteries, to make sure its population remains safe as it continues to fight against Hamas in Gaza.
Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. If you want to read more of his work, fdd.org, and we always appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you so much.
Coming up in about 25 minutes this morning, we're going to be joined here by George Conway, who will be discussing his new group, the Society for the Rule of Law Institute. Stick around for that discussion. Until then, it's our open forum. Any public policy issue, any political issue that you want to talk about, the phone lines are yours to do so. The numbers are on your screen. Go ahead and start calling in, and we'll be right back.
C-SPAN Now is a free mobile app featuring your unfiltered view of what's happening in Washington, live and on demand. Keep up with the day's biggest events with live streams of floor proceedings and hearings from the U.S. Congress, White House events, the courts, campaigns, and more from the world of politics, all at your fingertips. You can also stay current with the latest episodes of Washington Journal and find scheduling information for C-SPAN's TV networks and C-SPAN Radio, plus a variety of compelling podcasts. C-SPAN Now is available at the Apple Store and Google Play. Download it for free today. C-SPAN Now, your front row seat to Washington, anytime, anywhere. C-SPAN's Campaign 2024 coverage continues with the presidential primaries and caucuses. Watch live on the C-SPAN networks as the first votes in the country are cast in the upcoming presidential election, along with candidate speeches and results, beginning with the Iowa caucuses on January 15th and the New Hampshire primary on January 23rd. Campaign 2024 on C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of politics.
A healthy democracy doesn't just look like this. It looks like this, where Americans can see democracy at work. When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
CSPANshop.org is C-SPAN's online store. Browse through our latest collection of C-SPAN products, apparel, books, home decor, and accessories. There's something for every C-SPAN fan, and every purchase helps support our nonprofit operations. Shop now or anytime at CSPANshop.org. Washington Journal continues.
About 8:50 on the East Coast, and it's our open forum. Time for any public policy issue, any political issue that you want to talk about. Phone lines are yours to do so. You can call in now. As you're calling in, situational awareness for today on Capitol Hill. The House is in at 10 a.m. Eastern. The Senate is in at 10 a.m. Eastern today. You can watch on C-SPAN and C-SPAN 2 respectively. On C-SPAN 3 at 10 a.m. Eastern, a hearing with FBI Director Christopher Wray on the oversight of his agency. That's before the Senate Judiciary Committee. You can also watch on cspan.org and the free C-SPAN Now app. And one note for later this afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern, NCAA All-American swimmer Riley Gaines and others will be testifying on the Biden administration's proposed rule change to Title IX to redefine sexual discrimination to include gender identity. You can watch the House Oversight Subcommittee hearing on C-SPAN 3, cspan.org, and the free C-SPAN Now video app. That's what's happening today on Capitol Hill here on C-SPAN. It's now your time to lead this program. Open forum, what's on your mind? Richard's up first in Sparta, New Jersey, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to talk about the war in the Middle East, but first I wanted to explain all politics in 1 minute. Politics is about people getting along and moving the society forward. They have to be a little empathetic for people. Now, one of the main things about humans is their amount of empathy they have. Some people have lots of empathy. They're the kind of person that would give their left kidney to somebody that they don't even know, share the farm. Other people are not empathetic. They're very non-empathetic. They would not, don't want to give anybody anything. And that's the definition of sociopath, by the way, very non-empathetic. If I ask somebody who's a sociopath to give money for the poor or education or universal health care, they would say no, okay? If I ask Republicans, they would also say no. So the point is that the Republicans tend to attract the more sociopathic or type of people, and the Democrats seem to attract the more empathetic people, sometimes to a fault. Now, the wars in the Middle East, they talk about the genocide in Gaza. There are 2 other wars going on in the Middle East right now, which nobody talks about. 1 million people have been killed in Yemen. Saudis have bombed them, the civilians, everything. No protests, nobody talks about it, but that's maybe a genocide when 1 million people die. In Syria, there are 377,000 who have died. That's still going on, and that may be a genocide. But nobody's out there protesting that. It's only when the Jews are killing Muslims that people get upset. So, and all kinds of things go on. But that's really what I have to say.
That's Richard in New Jersey. This is Walton, Indiana, Republican. Good morning.
Yeah, should anybody be surprised that the aerial bombardment equipment provided by the United States to Israel is American? American airplanes, American bombs, and so forth. Given the fact that the bombing has killed over 13,000 civilians, 2/3 of whom have been women and children, should we be surprised that the allies of Hamas are now attacking American military people in the Middle East? And even if they have the population of the Middle East is overwhelmingly Muslim, even if they hate the Iranians or they hate Hamas or Hezbollah, do you think there might be broad-based sympathy and concern by the population, Arab and Muslim population of the Middle East, over the fact that so many civilians have been killed by the Israeli in Gaza. I mean, that's something that Americans should really think about.
To Steve in Missouri, Independent. Good morning. It's open forum. What's on your mind?
Yeah, we have to support Ukraine and Israel, because if we don't, we're going to have to go over there and fight them ourselves. And as far as the wall, Trump did nothing for the wall. He spent $8 trillion in 4 years. He did nothing for us. It all went to the wealthy. And if the Republicans deny this aid to these people, I don't care how broke they say we are, the Republicans ran up most of the debt. They will have a firestorm that they will never be able to put out against the Republican Party. Thanks.
On aid to Ukraine, a vote expected today in the Senate on the funding vehicle that would move the emergency funding legislation. Over $100 billion is what the Biden administration is requesting for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, border security as well. That package is that vehicle that would move that package, a vote happening on that later today in the Senate. Also today in the Senate, a classified briefing, and senators expected to hear from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. That briefing coming a day after a letter from the White House to Capitol Hill saying that the U.S. is nearly out of money for Ukraine. The letter coming from the budget chief of the United States. It was talked about yesterday in the White House briefing room, and again, more today on Ukraine on Capitol Hill. This is Tabitha in Colorado, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. This is open forum, right?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm calling to see if anybody watched Rachel Maddow's show last night with Liz Cheney. I think everybody needs to read Cheney's book, so maybe we can come to the middle where most of America is and all start working together again to make sure, yes, the world is safe, but if we lose America, everything's gone.
That's Tabitha in Colorado. New books are often released on Tuesdays, usually released on Tuesdays. And Liz Cheney's new book, Oath and Honor, officially released today. A memoir and a warning. This is how the publisher describes it in the Amazon website listing of it. A gripping first-hand account of the January 6, 2021 insurrection from inside the halls of Congress, from origins to aftermath, as Donald Trump and his enablers betrayed the American people and the Constitution by the House Republican leader who dared to stand up to it. Liz Cheney, her book, Oath and Honor. This is Kevin in Ohio, Independent. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. You just had a story on there about Iran's role in Israel-Hamas war. Today is the 5th, am I correct? 12/5/2023.
That's the date, Kevin.
Why is it? Yeah, 1 times 2 times 5 times 2 times 2 times 3 is 120. And Iran's role in Israel-Hamas war equals 120. You guys are all being set up by this gematria.
All right, we'll hold off on conspiracy theories. We'll go to Brenda in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Good morning.
Good morning, America. I just have a quick comment about how President Biden is handling things. It could be much better. The people that are still over, bring them home. And the way he goes away every weekend instead of being in the White House trying to figure out how to make America better is just so disappointing to me. I voted for him, and when it comes time to vote again, he's not getting my vote. It's just a shame on how he's running the country right down the toilet. And I'll tell you something. Please listen. It's later than we think. And I'm voting for President Trump. Trump did a lot of good things for America when he was in office, and I'm hoping he'll get back in. Thank you so much for listening.
That's Brenda in New Jersey. It's just past 9 a.m. on the East Coast. About 15 minutes left here in Open Forum. We're going to be joined by George Conway in about 15 minutes. He's going to be talking about his new group, the Society for the Rule of Law Institute. You'll be able to chat with him But for these 15 minutes, your calls, any topic in our open forum. Did want to note the lead story in today's Wall Street Journal getting a lot of attention. Ex-U.S. envoy is held as a longtime Cuba spy. This is just the lead paragraph of that story. A former senior U.S. diplomat who served in embassies across Latin America was accused of spying for Cuba's intelligence services for decades in one of the highest-reaching and longest-lasting security breaches of the federal government. That's according to a criminal complaint unsealed on Monday. And it was Attorney General Merrick Garland who announced the arrest of the former U.S. ambassador to Bolivia. Victor Manuel Roca is his name. That's taking place during a press conference yesterday. Here's a bit from it.
The complaint alleges that Rocha sought out and used his positions within the United States government to support Cuba's clandestine intelligence gathering mission against the United States. After the FBI received information that Rocha was a covert agent of Cuba's intelligence service, an FBI undercover proceeded to engage with Rocha on several occasions. As detailed in the complaint, Rocha repeatedly referred to the United States as, quote, the enemy. During the undercover, he told the undercover that his efforts to infiltrate the United States government were, quote, meticulous and, quote, very disciplined. And he repeatedly bragged about the significance of his efforts, saying that, quote, what has been done has strengthened the revolution immensely. The FBI arrested Rocha on Friday in Miami. He is making his initial appearance in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida this afternoon. As is always the case, the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I want to thank the FBI, the Department's National Security Division, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, as well as our partners at the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service for their excellent work on this case. Those who have the privilege of serving in the government of the United States are given an enormous amount of trust by the public we serve. To betray that trust by falsely pledging loyalty to the United States while serving a foreign power is a crime that will be met with the full force of the Justice Department.
Attorney General Merrick Garland, that was yesterday. If you want to watch that full event, you can do so on our website at cspan.org. Back to your calls in open forum. This is David, Lee's Summit, Missouri, independent. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I have 2 quick points. On the war in Gaza right now, if you do your research, you'll find that Netanyahu visited Russia multiple times. I believe the last one was 2022. We all know that Trump is friends with Russia. Netanyahu visits Russia. And then Netanyahu, who was under duress in the Israeli government, all of a sudden he has the best intelligence service in Hamas. And by the way, who put Hamas in power? It was Netanyahu. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's the truth. And all of a sudden, there's an attack that Israel doesn't know anything about. And now we're not giving any aid to Ukraine at all. Who does that benefit? Which politician does that benefit? And the last thing I want to say is when Americans keep calling in talking about how bad Biden's doing and how Trump did so well, Americans are very